Hello, anatomy friends. This is Dr. Alsup, and in this video, we are going to be discussing bone fractures, which is probably something that you have some form of experience with. Even if you haven't had a bone fracture, you likely know someone who has had a bone fracture. So maybe we can put some of those terms that you may have heard, we'll define them, and get a better understanding here. All right, so there are going to be four learning objectives to work through, with a lot of focus on defining and describing the different types of fractures. So let's jump right into them. And many clinicians begin a description of a fracture by either labeling it as open, sometimes you'll hear compound, or closed, aka simple. And they start with this description because it is visible. Either a fractured component has broken the skin or it hasn't. So, an open or compound fracture is the type of fracture that does break through the skin, and this tends to be a bit more severe. However, there are some mechanisms of fracture that can make a closed fracture quite severe as well, particularly if it's affecting surrounding structures. So, just to define, a closed or simple fracture does not break through the skin. Stress fractures are going to be fractures that occur without very visible or dramatic fragments. They are generally a series of microscopic breaks or fissures in a location. These are often due to repetitive stresses, such as you can think of running or jumping, or other disease processes, such as osteoporosis. Up to 25% of all stress fractures involve the tibia, which makes sense. It is going to be the weight-bearing bone of the leg, and the leg has to deal with a good amount of the stress that comes with overall body weight. So it makes a lot of sense that tibia is an area of focus. Vertebral bodies are another common area for stress fractures. The image on the right is showing an area of stress fractures on the radius, and it also has some surrounding irritation. But sometimes stress fractures don't show very readily on radiographs as well. Let's discuss three other types of fractures, starting with comminuted fractures. These are colloquially referred to as shattered bone. So a comminuted fracture will have bone fractures in three or more places. So you'll have three or more actual fragmented components. These tend to be pretty serious and slow to heal, as it's often difficult to reduce the fragmented pieces back together. An impacted fracture has one of the fragmented portions being forcibly driven into the interior portion of the other fragmented component. And these are usually caused by high velocity injuries. Think of like a car crash or something like that. And lastly, green stick fractures are unique in that they only occur in juveniles or individuals whose bones have not fully calcified or hardened. And what will happen with a green stick fracture is you generally have a partial fracture. One side may break, but the opposite side tends to just bend, similar to how when you're trying to break a green twig or a branch from a tree, one side may break, but the other side just bends, and that's actually where you get the name green stick. We will discuss specific fractures in specific bones as we talk about each individual bone or region. But instead, let's turn our attention to how fragments will actually heal. And I'm going to avoid giving time estimates for these steps, as each person and each type of injury causes substantial differences in timelines. But one thing I will note that is, as soon as a bone fractures, your body goes quickly into recovery mode, so almost immediately. And there's going to be four major steps for bone fracture repair. The first is going to be the formation of a fracture hematoma. So with a bone fracture, the blood vessels in that region will tear, and that causes bleeding, and that bleeding leads to the fracture hematoma. And because circulation at the site of injury stops for a short time, nearby bone cells will die, and this causes inflammation to occur because of all that cellular debris. And that is why you almost always have inflammation associated with fractures. But you can't keep functioning blood vessels away for long. Fibroblasts in the area or around the periosteum will start to deposit collagen. And some cells will differentiate into chondroblasts to produce fibrocartilaginous patches, or you may have a full fibrocartilaginous callus. Osteogenic cells will differentiate into osteoblasts, which will form a bony callus to replace the fibrocartilaginous callus. And this will serve as a temporary splint to join those broken ends of the bone together. The last step in healing of fractures is going to be remodeling of bone, and this step can be quite variable in terms of length. Osteoclasts will dissolve small fragments of the broken bone, and osteoblasts will deposit extracellular matrix that will form spongy bone, which may eventually be replaced by compact bone, depending on the location of the bone. Now, often a healed fracture leaves a slight thickening in the area where the fracture occurred, and that's often visible on radiographs. But sometimes, and given enough time, it can heal so well that there's no trace of a fracture at all, depending on the severity. All right, let's move to treatments. There's going to be three major goals for treatment. First and foremost, we want to realign the fragmented parts. We will talk about the different ways to do that in a moment. Then often the next steps will be to immobilize the fractured area to maintain that realignment and not allow the calluses that are forming to break again. This immobilization will also protect surrounding structures to the fracture. So it'll protect say the neurovasculature, or if there's any vital organs in the region. And lastly, as you might imagine, restoration of function is going to be a major treatment goal. So let's get a bit more into detail as to what setting a fracture actually means. And this is clinically referred to as a reduction, which is just a realignment of those fragmented parts. So a closed reduction is when fractured ends are aligned by manual manipulation and the skin stays intact. All right. So there's no need for surgery for a closed reduction. That's not true for an open reduction. That involves realignment through surgical intervention. And this often involves plates or screws or pins or maybe all three, depending on the severity. And these will place the fragmented parts in realignment and help them stay aligned for that healing process to occur. All right, let's do a practice question. And this specific question is very similar to the type of question you will see on the assessment. So you receive a report from the radiologist concluding that you have shattered the midshaft of your right femur. What type of fracture have you most likely suffered from? So pause the video if you need to think through it. And when ready, let's discuss how A, or a comminuted fracture, is the correct answer. Comminuted fractures are often colloquially referred to as a shattered bone. So that means you have multiple fragments. Green stick fractures, that's not correct. That involves a potential break of bone on one side, but a bending on the other. So that's not going to be shattering. An impacted fracture is better described as the fragmented part being forcibly driven into the other. So not the fracture type generally described as shattered. So all signs are pointing towards comminuted being the best answer. Excellent. Thank you so much for your time and attention.